Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to talk a little bit about unlocking observability of mainframe data, single pane of glass, storage, etc. So yeah, it's going to be an exciting topic, and we have a great demo for you today as well. I am Dustin Froyum. I'm one of the founders of VirtualZ, and I am here with our co-founder and CTO, Vince Ray. Thanks for joining me today, Vince.
Oh, happy to be here. Good to see you, Dusty.
Okay, and just a little quick overview of our agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit about the PropelZ architecture and overall just kind of how PropelZ works and some of the features. But then we're going to quickly dive into the use cases around how PropelZ provides real-time observability data to your preferred platform. We're going to talk a little bit about storage and recovery of observability data as well. So that's another use case. We're going to have a demo of this in action with Splunk. And then we'll talk a little bit about the pricing and Q&A, and we'll get out of here. Just a couple housekeeping notes. If there's questions along the way, please drop those into the Q&A tab. I'll also look at chat just in case you missed the Q&A tab. This will also be available for playback on our YouTube channel or on our podcast channel called Skyward Data. That's available on any of the podcasting platforms. All right, Vince, let's dive into this. So, can you just kind of walk us through just the basic architecture of PropelZ and how it functions, and then we'll kind of get into the meat and potatoes around observability and some of the magic that happens there.
Yeah. So PropelZ is basically a transactional way to move data from mainframe to really just about anywhere. Typically when we talk about PropelZ, we describe it as kind of a three-stage process. There's an ingestion phase. Where do you want to get the data from? Often we talk about that as file data, vSAM files or whatever. But as we're going to see today, PropelZ isn't limited to things like vSAM files. It can be anything. It can be really any type of data that exists on the mainframe, or even that the mainframe has access to over a network connection. So, that's the first part of PropelZ. Where do we get the data from? The middle part, or the processing engine in PropelZ, is mostly about things like data transformation. So I might have a vSAM file and records on that file, but it may not be doing me a lot of good in that format. I may need to transform them to rows and columns for a database, or in this example we're going to talk through today, probably more important than that, we use PropelZ's ability to transform that data into things like structured XML objects or JSON objects or CSV objects. So, understanding the data and its formats and all the data types that might be in it, and then transforming that data into a structure that can be useful in other platforms is really the core, central part of PropelZ. And then finally, the output stage. The output stage of PropelZ is, now that I've got this data, what do I want to do with it? And again, most commonly we talk about that as, a JDBC process. So, those, let's say vSAM file records that I converted to rows and columns. Now I want to insert that data into a database somewhere out in the cloud, in my own data center, wherever it happens to be. And because we do that kind of thing in a standards-based way using JDBC, the number of targets we can support are, huge. There's probably close to 100 different kinds of databases that we can target. And, as I said, for the ingestion part, Yeah, we often talk about it as things like databases and JDBC, but it turns out PropelZ is totally open-ended. The output could be anything. It could be, database as I described. It could be, invoking an API to put that data in just about any application anywhere. Really, if you could imagine it, you can connect the PropelZ output stream to it, and then you can do whatever you like about that data. So PropelZ is very simple. I mean, I've talked about it a lot, but it's basically just a command line utility. It can be run as a batch job. It could be run interactively. For some use cases, like what we're going to talk about today, you might even set it up so that it's always running and always processing, let's say management data or whatever else it is. It can be big batches. In other words, you might have terabytes of data that you need to move through PropelZ. It can also work in incremental ways. So it's you know, just send me the records that are changed in the last 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it happens to be. And then, finally, the processing we do in PropelZ is designed to be zip eligible. So whatever MIPS we use, and it's honestly, it's a very small number, but the MIPS we use don't impact, software cost on the mainframe. If you've got a zip engine, we're going to run on low cost zip MIPS, and those, the way I like to say it is that doesn't spin the software meter for, most of the other products on the mainframe. So, very low cost to operate. And in fact, you could have many copies of PropelZ running at the same time. It's not a all or nothing. You might have one set of data going to a database, another set of data going into a tool like Splunk. Really, sky's the limit. And that's generally the idea of Splunk. How do we take valuable mainframe information, whatever it is, and make sure that it's where we need it for whatever use cases we've got.
Thanks for that overview, Vince. You want to dive in a little bit deeper about particularly how we stream this and what that looks like, and then we'll talk about storage, and then we'll do the demo.
Yeah, so with the background, what I just explained in mind, one of the use cases that we've heard loud and clear in speaking to customers is I'd like to be able to get my management data from mainframe and either push it to another platform where I'm going to do something with it, or push it directly into a tool like Splunk or some of the others that you see on the slide here. Now, in the case of, and this is exactly the architecture I talked about a minute ago. Instead of files, though, we're processing things like ZOS SMF data or ZOS console message traffic, or various logs directly out of important mainframe subsystems. So the input stage gets replaced by a tool or a set of tools that we offer in the box with PropelZ that allow you to connect and read, let's say SMF or console messages. So that's on the input side. On the output side, you can, instead of going to something like a relational database with this information, what we've done is we've developed a way that we can go directly to things like the Splunk API. So, and you'll see this in the demo we're talking about. What the demo reveals is really simple use case. It's mainframe console message traffic coming through PropelZ, and then PropelZ pushes that directly to the Splunk API so that you have visibility of console message traffic inside of Splunk. The pattern would be a little different depending on exactly what tool you're trying to interface with, and whatever the details are, but it's pretty much, our standard approach for this stuff. Get the management data you want, and, implicit in that, there could be filtering, there could be, all sorts of other stuff going on there. In other words, I don't necessarily have to take all of my SMF records. I might just take, let's say the security records or the performance records, or, whatever you feel you want to deal with, and then, push them forward. I might take for some LPARs and not other LPARs. There's many, many different kinds of, filtering options that we can use there. And, same thing on the output side. Many of these products are, very sophisticated, and they have lots of different ways of pushing data in. So, you can, do that as, here's an event, and let, the management tool do whatever it wants with it. You could do something more granular than that, creating objects and, visualizations and dashboards and all sorts of other things that go with that. Really, sky's the limit here.
Awesome. So Vince, this is a use case that you and I have heard quite a bit about. It's actually a fairly simplified use case, and I'm going to ask you about PropelZ, but also we have a new offering too that could probably play in this space as well, correct?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I just explained was, very specific to management data, but it turns out, as you said, Dusty, we hear a lot of need for, how do I preserve mainframe, whatever it is, legacy information, somewhere else. Maybe I'm migrating away from the mainframe. Maybe I want to go to a different type of storage. Maybe I've got, the one we hear a lot is I've got, hardware-based virtual tape libraries. They're expensive, they're costly to maintain, et cetera, et cetera. How do I get that data to cloud? And doing that real time going forward is not a big deal. But what do you do with maybe the million volumes that you've already got sitting in your data center someplace? That's where the challenge sometimes is. So, we can solve that using the PropelZ technology I described. What we provide is, a little bit of an extra layer that, essentially looks at what you got and builds up an inventory of, oh, here are the million tapes, or, whatever it is that need to be moved. And then how do we do that in parallel in the most efficient way to, move that data to, some other source. With PropelZ, typically that other source is going to be a database of some sort. And honestly, sometimes that comes in handy, because if we were to look at the tables that we're creating, we see, basically blobs of, here's the record bit for bit that we read off the tape. And here are things like record numbers that you can use as keys. So, again, you have the kind of application that needs to kind of, spin to record number 4,000,006. Having that key is a very handy thing to do. Suddenly you can process that data with SQL query, and that sometimes makes that much, much easier to do. Dusty, as you alluded, we have a relatively new product called Flows, which is, somewhat similar to that, except the target wouldn't be a database. The target would be some type of storage, object storage, so an S3 bucket or a Glacier bucket, or Google Cloud Storage, or, whatever you want it to be there. And in that case, what you're going to have are still files. In other words, instead of SQL to process it, you'd probably still do, open, close, read, write kinds of functions to it. So it kind of really just depends on, what do you need to get that data into? What applications need to process that data? And that would steer you towards one or the other. The important thing, though, is, when you look at small files, you don't often appreciate this, but the way PropelZ is structured with especially with the JDBC layer involved, it's really efficient. I mean, JDBC is designed for large scale movement of data over networks. And you look at some of the other alternatives that people use, and a lot of them are things like HTTP transactions, which are text protocols. They're small buffers, relatively speaking. And just that, and maybe it's 10%, but if you've got a million tapes to move, that might be the difference between a week or two and a month or two. So it's important when you got large volumes of data to deal with, that whole process is efficient as possible. And whether you use flows or propels, you get something that's very efficient that way.
Awesome. All right, well, let's take a look at the demo and make sure the volume's all the way up here. All right. That was an awesome demo. I'm going to come back and ask a couple questions about that in a moment, but let me just talk a little bit about um, Propel's pricing and what you get for your investment here. We're focused in on some pretty narrow use cases, but Propel's is a pretty powerful tool and has a lot of use cases. I know Vince, had a lot of we've had a lot of tape migration use cases, populating data lakes or databases for AI and BI purposes. So there's a lot of particular opportunities to implement Propels for the $50,000 per year that we charge for a license and maintenance fee. This is unlimited, so you can put this on every LPAR. We don't measure MIPS, MSUs, installation, sysplexes. So it is for your enterprise and all these use cases. We also ship it with 5 JDBC drivers. If you want to go to one of those targets, we can always test and add more for a small uplift. And so you can just reach out to us about what that would be depending on what the driver is. But we ship it with MySQL, SQL, Postgres, Snowflake, and Oracle. Those are the 5 drivers you get into the box today. But again, we can add those additional drivers in if you need them. And those are extremely high performing tested drivers. So it's a very, very good value from that perspective. So Vince, I'm going to start off with a couple questions, and we'll see if there's any other questions that come up. Go ahead and raise your hand or drop them in the Q&A tab, and I'll be glad to add you or put you in the just read your question as well. So Vince, you kind of showed us what the setup was with for Splunk, but what is the installation process and getting time to operation with PropelZ itself from a baseline standpoint?
Yeah, core PropelZ is about as easy as it gets to install for mainframe software. The way this works is we ship you basically it's an archive file, a tar file, a zip file if you're familiar with that in Windows, and everything you need is in that one package. So really what it comes down to is, restore that compressed archive and everything you need will be there. There's a little bit of work to do to configure the targets that you want. I mean, you could think of what you saw in the demo as configuring for Splunk as a target. If you're using a database, there are going to be things like what credentials do I use? Where is my database? It's host name, that kind of thing. Again, it's not coding in any way. It's really just a matter of, here are my credentials, here's where my database is, and, that sort of thing. Beyond that, very, very little needs to be done. I mean, if you're, especially if you're working with one of those database targets that we certify out of the box, you can generally just pick up the configuration data that we supply and run with it. You might have, we give you control over that. If you don't like, I don't know, the way we index your data, you're welcome to change that. If you want to add a few columns to what we would normally create on the target database, you can do that. I mean, there's probably infinite customization possible depending on what your needs are. But again, that's really up to you. If you just pick up the configuration that we supply out of the box, you can be up and running in a couple of minutes sometimes when you need to do this. And it's not just us, because we know how to do this because we wrote the software. Many of the partners that we work with that have been through this, they tell us, I started from nothing. I never even, don't even know what this product does. And, a half hour later, being productive with it. So, if you got a super tightly controlled environment and, you need to ask permission to open, outbound network connections to whatever targets. I mean, certainly that can add to it. A lot of folks have change control and all kinds of process around that. So, I'm not really talking about that part. I'm just talking about configuring our software and what you would need to do to get off the ground. And that's, as I said, that's about as easy as it gets.
And Vince, can you talk a little bit about the performance as well? And I know we mostly talk about that in the context of, populating the rows and columns into a database. So maybe in that context, what can we expect? And I think you touched on some of the advantages that we have, kind of being within the native driver, often binary versus text-based. Yeah, can you just
Yeah,
go through that?
yeah, and absolutely every customer we speak to will ask that question. How fast is it? How, and of course, it's it's hard to generalize because some of that at least depends on how much network capacity do you have? How big is the system you're going to? That's the target. All of that comes into play. But yeah, I can share our experience. We test in a very small environment. Really, we have two that we test in. One is an IBM Z system, and the other is a system that's hosted on a ZVM environment where we have a ZOS system running under ZVM. We're limited to 3% of a single processor on a Z16 in that case. So, small environment is the point, very small for, typical mainframe. And in those environments, we'll test to things like Amazon RDS instances, especially running in, the smallest possible tier. So sometimes free tier, sometimes, really tiny virtual machines running the database software. And in that configuration, we generally, with just as an example, and you'll see this in some of our other, blogs and videos. With Postgres, we can do about 6,000 rows per second. And these are large rows. I mean, the original data that we start with are, 1K records with 20 fields or so. We transform them into rows and columns and insert those rows. Each row is about 1K wide. So that's not teeny little records. That's pretty diverse records, and there's a little bit of every possible type of data in there. There's certainly text. So you've got ASCII and EBCDIC going on. There's certainly packed decimal. So you have those kind of conversions or things like mainframe style floating point numbers. So it is a representative of the complexity of the kind of data, and we still manage to get 6,000 rows per second. Different databases and different configurations, we've seen generally close to that. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. And again, keep in mind, what I'm describing is a really, really slow and very small environment. The tests I run from our ZPDT system to the cloud kind of hover in, similar ranges. And there we're doing it on nothing more than kind of a consumer grade gigabit network connection. So, and it's certainly on our list of things to do to work with a large customer who's got a serious mainframe, serious amount of bandwidth, very large database servers. We'd love to do another round of formal benchmarking there, and as soon as we do, we'll definitely post that. But that opportunity it just hasn't come up to us. But that said, we as Dusty described, we feel pretty good about the performance we get. We benchmark against even things like FTP and just standard file transfer, and we generally find that we're anywhere from 20 to a couple 100% faster than some of the more simple file transfer approaches out there. So yeah, performance is a really important thing. Where it comes up, certainly if you got a handful of files and you're doing like ad hoc processing and that kind of stuff, that's one thing. If you got the example we've talked about before, I've got libraries of virtual tapes, and maybe forget terabytes, I might have exabytes of data that or petabytes of data that I'm trying to move. Now all of a sudden, it makes sense to do some benchmarking and try and understand how to best deal with that. Some of those projects could literally be a month long because of the amount of bandwidth and so on and so on. So yeah, and I think one of the I'll just put a plug in for VirtualZ. I think one of the advantages of working with us is we know how to answer these questions, and we're happy to work with you on just getting that answer. How long should I expect this to take? Is it practical to do it this way? Sometimes those answers aren't always obvious, and so you dig in and do some real benchmarking. I wouldn't want people just to rely on a couple of simple numbers that I throw out and then find either that doesn't meet their needs or there's a better way of doing it that could have been 10 times faster. We'll help you find that. Sorry, Dusty, I drifted a little bit.
All good. All good. All right. Any other final questions? Okay, let me talk a little bit about some resources we have. So we've got a blog, Demos on Demand. I'll just put a plug in for the other demo of PropelZ as well. So what that will show is basically from install, moving a large vSAM file to MySQL database, and then presenting that data in Splunk, and over a real elapsed time that was under an hour. So just again, kind of talking about the time to value, ease of installation, and ease of configuration. That gives you a very good idea of what the experience is like. We have demos of all our other products as well, Lozen, Zack, and the Flows one is coming. That is a brand new release. And so keep your eyes out for another kind of an announcement webinar on Flows in particular, and we'll go through that. And then, yeah, so just check out our events page. We've got lots of stuff going on. And certainly if you want to try any of our products, that's no cost for a eval period, and we'll be glad to assist you with that. Yeah, and if you want to reach out to us, hello@virtualzcomputing.com. That's a great place to start. Or there, you can just go to our website, and there's a form on there as well. And we'd love to hear from you. Talk about not only use cases for PropelZ, but across our products, we can handle just about any mainframe data integration solution or situation that's out there. So, yeah. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thank you.